Crystal, will you just let me know when we've got a critical mass of folks joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Yes, I think we are good to at least start with a round of introductions and such. We have around 18 people on the call.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone today for joining us. My name is Keith Hay. I'm the Director of Policy at the Energy Office. I'm joined today by my colleague Crystal, who is helping to lead the work of the Building Performance Standard Task Force, as well as a couple of members of the team from Lotus Sustainability. And they are one of two consultants who are working with the Energy Office and the task force to help achieve the recommendations that we are required to provide coming out of this task force effort. We're also working with Group 14 that is building out a tool to assess the EUI targets, which we'll have more to say about today. So in terms of the sort of run of show today, I'll start with a little bit of sort of why we're here and what we're intending to do. But before we do that, I did want to let everyone on the call know that we are recording this and we will make it available from the Energy Office website and YouTube channel. We are also live streaming at the moment. You can feel free to use the chat for questions. The team that's joining me today will be watching that and will be able to help facilitate some discussion. We're also intending to really break the conversation today into two larger sections. We'll sort of cover some background and statutory requirements of the task force. We'll break for Q&A, and then we will take a look at the work that the task force has done in terms of developing a set of recommendations for how building owners might achieve the recommended targets. And we'll leave time on the back end of that for questions as well. So appreciate that. Just a little bit of sort of Zoom etiquette as we get started. To the extent that you can, please rename yourself with your name and your organization so that we know what organizations are joining us today. I think everybody does know how to do that, but if you hover over the box that has your name, you should see 3 small dots appear in the upper right corner, and that would allow you to rename. For those of you on the phone, of course, you won't be able to do that. We would ask that you keep yourself muted unless one of the team members does reach out to you and asks you gives you the opportunity to ask a question or make a comment. And then please feel free to leave your cameras on and off. As we do get into the Q&A period at the end of each of the different sections, we'll assess how much time we can make available to each of the participants on the call today, and that may depend on how many questions we have in the chat or how many folks raise hands at that point in time. So again, here's the agenda. We want to go through some background. We'll look at sort of a high-level overview and map, the task force recommendations, and then next steps. So I always like to ground the work of the task force really in the state's greenhouse gas pollution reduction goals and the state's roadmap. So today, Colorado has mid-decade goals, a 2030 carbon reduction goal or greenhouse gas reduction goal, and a 2050 reduction goal. And the 2030 goal is a 50% economy-wide reduction by that 2030 target. And so as we get into the work of the task force, it's really looking at meeting the mid-decade goal and then that 2030 target. Coming out of the statutory establishment of the greenhouse gas targets, Governor Polis asked the Energy Office to work with a number of additional state agencies to construct a greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. And the intent of the roadmap was partially to lay out potential pathways to meeting those three different targets that we have, but also to establish a set of near-term actions that the state would commit to meet those goals. And so among those near-term actions, a number of them were focused on the building sector, which the analysis in the roadmap identified as one of the 5 leading sections of emissions in the state. And so in addition to the benchmarking and building performance standards in House Bill 21-1286, we also developed additional requirements around energy efficiency for utilities, what we are calling clean heat planning that is focused on reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of the state's natural gas utilities, and directing them to develop plans to work with customers to reduce emissions from customer buildings and appliances. So House Bill 21-1286 really puts in place a set of sector-wide emissions reduction targets. And that's, I think, really the first thing to clarify about the bill, is that it's not directing each individual building or building owner to meet that target, but it's really establishing a sector-wide target with the additional goal of helping building owners increase energy efficiency, which by doing that will allow them to better manage their energy costs, lower their bills, and then reduce the emissions from the built environment. So under the statute, our office was required to develop a statewide benchmarking program, and that really was intended to help establish different pathways that building owners could pursue that would all roll up to those sectoral targets. It's worth noting at the outset that the building benchmarking and performance standard really only applies to commercial multifamily and public buildings that are 50,000 square feet and larger. And so while we are working through an analysis of exactly how many buildings that would cover in the state, we believe that it's somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 buildings. We initially thought it was closer to the higher end of that number. As we worked through data with county assessors and different reporting entities, I think we're discovering that the number might be slightly lower than initially put in place. So as the slide here describes, benchmarking is really just the process of tracking a building's energy use, usually through utility data for both the gas usage in the building as well as the electric usage in the building, and then comparing that energy use to similar building types. So sort of the second point to highlight here for some folks is that we are not comparing every building to every other building in that category of covered buildings that are 50,000 square feet and above. The intent of the benchmarking program is really to put buildings of like category together. So if we're looking at schools, that might be one category of building. If you're looking at municipal buildings, courthouses, for example, that might be a different category of building. You might be looking at large commercial spaces as a third category of building. And so we understand and recognize within the work of the task force that different types of buildings have different energy use profiles, and really want to ensure that we're making that comparison to relevant building types. The data is listed here for the first submission of the energy usage data to the Energy Office, and that's December 21st, 2022. And then after that, it is June 1st of every subsequent year. There's also a link here on the slide, which we will make these slides available from the Energy Office website, that you can get additional information about the program. You can also reach out to me, and Crystal can put my email address in the chat as well as hers, and we are happy to answer any questions that folks might have coming out of this. Again, House Bill 21-1286 established those sectoral goals of 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. It also established the baseline year against which those emissions reductions would be compared, and that's a 2021 baseline year. So all building owners will need to meet certain targets in each of those years. And we will talk later on as we describe the different compliance pathways about some different alternative compliance pathways that we think provide some amount of flexibility to building owners as we look at compliance. The building performance standard in essence created an energy performance target or an emissions target after a specific amount of time. And again, I'll describe in more detail in a bit what the task force ultimately landed on as the appropriate performance standard. So again, I want to note as we move into this, that 20% applies not to each building individually, but to the building sector as a whole. So the BPS task force in statute was directed to have members representing different groups and organizations. And I am not going to attempt to read all of this here, but the idea behind this was to be able to take a comprehensive look at energy policy goals, climate policy goals, building construction, building use, jobs impacts, and community impacts. And so the representation across the task force really brings a diverse set of voices to the table to talk about how we get to that 7% and that 20% target over time. We, as the Energy Office, have been staffing the work of the task force, and Will Tour, our executive director, who unfortunately is not able to join us today, has also been part of that conversation on an ongoing basis. The task force began meeting in October of 21 and has been working roughly monthly through a series of different meetings to get to the recommendations that they ultimately will deliver to Director Tour, to the governor, and to the Air Quality Control Commission. So in looking at the recommendations that the task force had to develop, it took into account a number of different things. As I said, one of them is the ways that building owners can meet a greenhouse gas reduction or an energy reduction target, the different types of properties and the energy use profile and energy use needs of those buildings, but also took into account the availability of workforce, whether that's workforce in the trades to actually do the work of some of the retrofitting that might be needed, as well as workforce to manage the energy consumption of buildings. The task force has had a lot of discussions around the cost, both financial and otherwise, as well as the benefits to upgrading and changing the energy use profiles of the various buildings. There have also been a lot of discussions and conversations about the availability of state programs, of local government programs, and of utility programs that can provide technical assistance or incentives. I will say, for those of you that are in the Xcel Energy Service territory who may be building owners or working with building owners, Xcel has just recently filed what is called a strategic issues proceeding at the Public Utilities Commission, where the company lays out its vision for how it will move forward with electric and gas energy efficiency, demand response, as well as beneficial electrification. And so while we are just starting down the road of that proceeding, I think that there will be a lot of new and interesting opportunities that will come out of that conversation with Xcel. The task force is also looking at support from the Energy Office and other state agencies to ensure that building owners can avoid fines. So the statute did allow for civil penalties for noncompliance with the building performance standards. But I want to be clear that our intent in setting up the program is really to get as many building owners as possible, and ideally every building owner, to a place where they really are not looking at facing penalties for noncompliance. We want to be able to work with building owners to actually achieve the various targets that are in statute. And for those of you on the call who may be owners or operators of public buildings are actually not subject to the penalties in the statute. And a public building is just a covered building. So that's a building 50,000 square feet and above, owned by the state or local government, a district or a special district under Title 32, a state or private institution of higher education, a school district or a charter school. And so those buildings do have targets subject to the building performance standards, but are not subject to any of the penalties that would otherwise apply to non-public buildings. So in thinking about all of the different things that the task force was considering, they also developed a set of principles that they felt would help guide their work in getting to a set of recommendations for how building owners could meet the targets. And so they were focused across 6 very broad areas. One related to equity, both equity for communities, but also equity for building owners as well, and different types of building owners. Principles around workforce development. We think that the building performance standard does provide an opportunity for jobs in Colorado, but we want to make sure that we are doing the outreach and providing the training so that we are building that workforce that can help building owners meet the targets that are out there. Principle around engagement and informed community. We think that it's really important, and the task force thinks that it's really important as we develop a set of recommendations that building owners and local governments really understand what the requirements are and to begin to develop a collaborative set of relationships that will help us meet those targets. Principles around reliability, cost, and streamlining of process. And these targets or principles were really important, I think, to the task force as they began to think about the work that they were doing. One thing that I think they have made clear throughout the process is, the building performance standards and the pathway to achieving those really has to be something that is achievable for building owners and understandable to building owners. And so it's part of the work that we in the Energy Office are doing is really to help try and build a platform that can do some of that education and work with building owners and utilities to help make the process manageable as we get to the building performance standards. So this is, I think, an overview of the goals and outcomes for the task force. And so, the recommendations are intended to ensure equity, reduction in carbon across the building sector in the state for covered buildings, and then to further clean energy goals in the state of Colorado. Again, the sector-wide targets and the intent is to develop a set of recommendations that will reduce emissions, lower energy costs, and improve indoor air quality. So there's a much larger set of slides that we have that will talk about what the task force recommendations are, both the primary recommendation and different pathways to compliance. But we wanted to stop here to see if there are any questions about the background or the statutory construction that led to the task force. So I don't know, Crystal, do we have any questions, or are we going to have?
We do have a few questions, and just a reminder to everyone on the call, if you raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of the Zoom meeting, we will call on you. Some people have been placing questions in the chat, and you can do that as well if you would like that better. Keith, we have 2 questions so far. The first question being, what is the possibility of changing the baseline year from 2021 to 2019? And I can throw it over to you, but I can provide some background on that. Is that 2021 baseline year is in our statute. So that is not able to be changed. We will have to use 2021 benchmarking data to inform our building performance standards. Keith, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't have, that's correct, Crystal, and important to note. I will say that while we are not able to change the baseline year, as you'll see going forward, I think that we have a couple of different ways that we can provide some amount of flexibility to building owners in the ways that they can comply going forward. So we'll talk more about that as we get into the various compliance pathways.
And then I'll ask the second question. This person said that they are hoping the state has a study or something from the task force which illustrates how the draft site UIs will be set in order to meet the 7% and 20% sector-wide GHG emission goals for the sector.
So excellent question. And when statute was passed and the task force was set up, we were not provided the funding or the opportunity to conduct something like a study. What we do have and what we are working with Group 14 on is a tool that will assess the emissions reductions for the sector as a whole, based on what we know of the buildings and what we know about the different compliance pathways. And so based on that tool, it will show if we are on target to meet the 7% or 20% targets, or if we are off track in meeting those goals. So while we don't have a study per se, we do have data on the buildings initially. We will get a lot more data when we get that first round of benchmarking information later this year. And that will, using the Group 14 tool, allow us to do an assessment of where we are and what kind of trajectories we could be on. And I'll say a little bit more perhaps about that set of trajectories as once we get through the different compliance mechanisms.
Yes, and I'll add to that too, of that for the sector-wide greenhouse gas reduction goals for the building sector. Keith already mentioned this, but the Colorado Energy Office will be the one tracking that using the Group 14 tool. And Keith will go into more of the metric of the BPS and what the building owners will be tracking on their side in the second part of this presentation. Right now, we're just talking more about the background. And so moving on, we have no more questions in the chat so far, but I do see someone has raised their hand. So if you would like to ask your question, please go ahead. I think Jim Obermeyer, you have your hand raised. You can ask your question now.
Yep, thanks, Crystal. Hey, so if we're using Energy Star Portfolio Manager kind of for benchmarking, in a sense of equity, is if a property is at a certain threshold, say 90% on Energy Star, are they exempt from this?
I can provide.
I was just gonna say, Crystal, do you want to jump in and take that one? Appreciate
Yes,
that.
I can provide some background here. So as we get more into the details of the metric of the BPS, we'll actually cover some of this. But an Energy Star score does not automatically exempt a building owner from the BPS because they're at a certain threshold. With that in mind, the task force and the state has considered high performing buildings and underperforming buildings when designing the building performance standard. So some buildings that may have an Energy Star score of 85 and up, they may be considered a high performing building, and they may meet their target right off the bat and may not need to make those changes. So there were considerations within the building performance standards for buildings that may meet other criteria, but a building owner cannot simply just be like, oh, I have a really great Energy Star score, I'm exempt. No, they still need to show that they have met their main metric for the BPS. It'll make a little bit more sense when we move forward with some of the slides. Okay, but thank you for that question.
Yeah, I'll hang on and listen in.
I don't see any more questions in the chat or any other hands raised, but does anyone else have any questions about the background of the benchmarking or BPS or why the state did this? Okay, Keith, I think we're good to move on.
Thank
I'll
you,
just hop
Crystal.
in here and note really quickly as well, there was a question in the chat regarding the slides, and those are posted on CO's website. So we've thrown the link in the chat a couple times, and I'll throw it in again so that people have access to that.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. So I just wanted to start with a timeline of sort of where we are and where we're headed for the building performance standards. And so I don't intend to walk through all of this, but just wanted again to highlight that first benchmarking data is due by December 21st. And really that we're talking about the first BPS compliance year will be out in 2026. So backing up from that 2026 compliance obligation that will actually trigger on June 1, 2027, the recommendations for the task force will be submitted by October 1 of 2022. And then that will then lead into an Air Quality Control Commission rulemaking, where the rules for the building performance standards will be developed and promulgated. And so the intent of structuring it this way was to provide a runway for building owners to first begin to understand what their building energy consumption and building energy profile is, then to understand what the actual performance standards would mean and what the compliance pathways would look like before having to actually meet the standards, and try to give some time for building owners to then take that tracking of energy consumption and really begin to make improvements in advance of that first compliance obligation out in 2027. So again, just to sort of note quickly that the task force is making a series of recommendations that will result in an Air Commission rulemaking. And so I think, as you will see here, in this part of the presentation, some of the task force recommendations are relatively high level for those of you who may be used to going through administrative process rulemakings. And the goal there is really to provide guidance to the Air Commission as it frames the rule language, because the task force itself is really not set up to craft and develop rules for all of the various components of the building performance standards. So moving then sort of from that timeline into what the actual recommendations and metrics are, the task force has a primary recommendation that the building performance standard should use property-specific energy use intensity as the metric for determining whether or not a building is in or out of compliance with the BPS. And so as part of the rulemaking process and moving forward, there will be the development of a site-specific EUI target based on different property types. Again, as it's listed here, you could think of offices, schools, hospitals. And those will be defined, and then we'll be using weather normalized data to determine whether or not that site EUI is in compliance. Again, it's something that building owners can easily track and report in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, an EPA-based tool. And it's that tool is actually directed to be used in 21-1286 for the purposes of benchmarking. So we're going to rely on Energy Star Portfolio Manager to sort of help underwrite the tracking and reporting of building energy use, which will then help determine the site EUI for any of the buildings.
Keith, I'm just going to chime in really quickly. We had it on another slide that isn't part of this presentation, but just in case some people aren't aware, site EUI is just energy use intensity of a building, and it's typically measured by the total energy consumed at a building divided by its square footage. So that's simply what site EUI is.
Thank you, Crystal. Always good clarification. Sometimes you get so used to doing this, you forget the things like that. So then moving on from sort of what the metric or how we're measuring buildings to how building owners can comply, the task force's primary recommendation is that building owners adopt increased levels of energy efficiency. So the idea there is that you are able to do the same things with your building with less energy overall, and that can be through reducing energy waste. You can think of it as changing out older motors, older HVAC units, changes in lighting, but all different ways that building owners can work with tenants to reduce the energy consumption in the building across time. So, every hour of the day as you make those changes. And that's really the primary target, because as we reduce energy consumption, we are going to be, primary pathway, because as we are reducing energy consumption, we will be reducing emissions. It will also help reduce energy costs for building owners and likely provide them some amount of bill stability as well. So, and I apologize in advance for what looks like the complexity of this chart, but Crystal and I and the Lotus team really wanted to try and give everybody on the call, as well as the task force members, sort of a sense of how the metrics and the pathways apply, so that at the end of the day, we get to site EUI that's met by building owners, and we get to emissions reduction targets that we need to get to over time. So I'm going to stop here and take a minute and walk through this, and I will encourage Crystal and the Lotus team to please jump in and correct or fill in anything that I missed. But we talked already about site EUI based on building or property type being the primary metric that we are going to use to measure whether or not buildings are complying. So underneath that, you can look at sort of two different lighter shaded green boxes. And the arrows are intended to represent the various pathways that would come out of a building owner taking those actions. So on that left side, you can see energy efficiency and electrification of 80% of the load. Either of those actions from a building owner could result in the site EUI being met. And at that point, the building owner would have complied. It's possible that the building owner could take one of those actions, and energy efficiency I'm lumping together as an action, but it may be multiple different programs a building owner is participating in, and still the site EUI isn't met for some reason. That then gets into the larger shaded blue box on the right that looks at alternative compliance pathways. And these are different options that a building owner could use one of or multiple of in order to comply with the site EUI. And so that would be adding on-site renewables or adding renewables under state statute that count for the purposes of on-site. It could be a partial electrification. So if a building owner started with energy efficiency, didn't meet site EUI, but they might consider partial electrification. They could also consider demand flexibility. And so in the course of the presentation, I'm going to talk a bit more about what each of those alternative compliance pathways look like and what the task force recommendations are. But again, the intent was to take you from that primary set of recommendations to meet site EUI. What happens if a building owner isn't able to meet it, and to show that there's some flexibility built in the different tools that a building owner can use to then get to meeting the site EUI. Now, we certainly understand that despite the flexibility that is built into the different compliance options in the top part of this, that there may well be building owners who are challenged for various reasons. And so that's why the task force is recommending a set of compliance adjustment options. And so that can actually be something that a building owner pursues from the outset. They might look at, for example, their capital cycle and understand that because of the capital cycle, a building owner might not be able to comply in the time frame required. And so that then moves them down into that compliance adjustment option from the outset. It's also possible that a building owner takes some of those initial actions, whether through energy efficiency or energy efficiency coupled with the alternatives, still isn't able to comply, and then moves into that compliance adjustment pathway. And so the task force is recommending adjustments both to target and timeline. And again, I will talk through each of those a little bit more in the presentation, but wanted to show that there are initial steps, there are alternatives that can be added to that set of initial steps, and then there's a set of compliance adjustment options that run sort of parallel at some level to that main set of compliance pathways. So the recommendation on renewable energy, and this is the first of those alternatives. The intent here is to allow building owners to add renewable energy generation to their building site or to their building energy use profile, and therefore to be able to reduce the energy consumption of that building. And that might include the use of solar, wind, geothermal, which the Energy Office worked last year on a couple of different bills related to geothermal energy development. And for solar energy, that could be installed on the building or off-site. And that off-site array would be allowed to count towards the energy consumption of the building, and happy to answer questions about that if there are additional questions. So the recommendation that the task force has adopted is that the AQCC, the Air Commission, should credit renewable energy generation based on avoided utility emissions. And in order to ensure that we are not double counting those emissions reductions, that the building owner would need to retain the renewable energy credits or RECs, or to ensure that the RECs are retired on behalf of the building owner. And so the goal here is to give building owners, again, that sort of alternative compliance pathway that, coupled with energy efficiency or an 80% electrification, would get them to a place where they would be in compliance with the site EUI target. And for the purposes of the crediting, we and the rules would look at what the emissions intensity of the underlying energy for the building would be. So that's not something a building owner would need to report. That's something that the Energy Office, as we are looking at compliance, will be managing related to the renewable energy. If a customer, a building owner, customer is my work in the utility world too many times. If a building owner is actually intending to use renewable energy as part of the compliance pathway. We do understand that there have been a lot of questions about the retention of RECs and what happens to building owners who've installed solar prior to this system. Certainly an issue that we are aware of, and we are in a lot of conversations with different stakeholders around how to try to give some credit for existing renewable energy systems. So that's something that the task force is looking at, and the Energy Office is looking at, but it's certainly an issue that today is still unresolved as we try to think through how to give credit for those existing renewable energy systems. For those who don't know, this defines what a REC or a renewable energy credit is. It's actually defined in Colorado law as the environmental attributes of 1 megawatt hour of electricity generation. And so every renewable energy system, again, those are defined in Colorado statute, will generate RECs, and building owners just need to know whether those RECs are ones that they retain or ones that a utility is retiring on behalf of them. So happy to answer more questions about RECs or the way renewable energy will be counted. But again, the intent here is to provide some amount of flexibility to building owners to allow them to count a certain amount of renewable energy generation towards that site EUI target. Electrification is another pathway that building owners can pursue as they look to comply with site EUI. Beneficial electrification is defined in statute, but essentially it is either avoiding the use of fossil gas or switching end uses from fossil gas to electricity. And so a good example of that would be taking existing space heating from fossil gas and transitioning that to a heat pump, whether ground source or air source heat pump, potentially shifting to geothermal loop heating or district heating might be another example. But that represents both the change in energy use, but importantly, a significant reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions from a building as we move from a grid that is, reliant on some amount of coal and fossil gas to a grid that is significantly cleaner over time. Based on the filings of the 6 utilities that control more than 90% of the fossil electricity generation in the state, they'll achieve an average greenhouse gas emission reduction on their systems of about 87% by 2030. And so that's really where electrification gets you that benefit of emissions reductions. There's also a significant increase in efficiency that results in a lower energy use overall. So the task force recommendation was that the Air Commission encourage building owners to work to replace fossil space heating and water heating, and that if a building owner were to displace 80% of their heating load for water and space with high efficiency electric equipment, that they would then be in full compliance with the BPS targets. But as you saw in the earlier slide in the map that we laid out for compliance pathways, if a building owner were to do less than 80%, they would get partial credit, and they could couple that with increases in energy efficiency, additions of renewable energy, and work towards full compliance with the site EUI. I think this just reiterates some of what we've already been able to cover here. And then moving then to the compliance adjustment options. Again, the task force has been very clear that as they make recommendations, we in the Energy Office and the task force really needs to make sure that we are providing enough flexibility for building owners who are not able to meet their target EUI or the target deadline. And so the task force really wants to build in recommendations related to adjustment options for both of those. So the first of those is really a timeline adjustment option. And the recommendation is that the Air Commission adopt a compliance adjustment that enables building owners to request a different timeline for compliance. So we had a question earlier about, can we change the benchmarking year from 21 to 19? And the answer was no. But the hope is that these compliance adjustment options can help building owners who may be struggling with the 2021 benchmarking year to begin to work towards reducing the energy use intensity of the building. in making this recommendation, the task force was thinking about what's listed here as examples of, different buildings or building owners who may well understand, once the rules are promulgated in 23, that they'll be subject to the building performance standard, and yet that simply doesn't line up with, for example, their capital cycle and their intent to do work on a building. Or they may already have planned to do, significant recommissioning or renovation of a building, but it doesn't fall before that first compliance deadline. So we understand that there are a lot of challenges for building owners. And the intent here is to provide that level of flexibility so that building owners can work to come into compliance, even if it means adjusting the timeline. The other is a target adjustment, and to allow building owners to adjust their site EUI target. And here, the Energy Office is anticipating that building owners will be required to provide documentation that demonstrates the maximum achievable site EUI, taking account of all of the different compliance pathways and alternatives that a building owner could use. It may well be that, for example, a building owner is experiencing financial hardship and is not able to take all of the actions necessary to come into compliance. We also are aware that there is sometimes a bit of a tension between EV charging, which is among the state's goals, and the reduction in a site EUI. And so we're trying to think about target adjustments that can help account for building owners that may be doing significant amounts of vehicle electrification on site, and for which portfolio managers not able to take account of that energy load, working towards reducing emissions in the transportation sector. And so that would be a place where we would anticipate a building owner might request a target adjustment to address that additional energy use on the building site that's really energy use in support of additional state policy goals on the transportation side of things. So let me stop there and see if there are questions. I imagine we have quite a few, and so happy to go back. I mean, before Crystal opens it up for questions, my intent in the presentation is really to tee up a conversation and a discussion about these issues. So happy to try and dig into as many details as we can today in response to the questions. I will say that there may be some questions that we get that we're going to have to take it back, do a little more thinking about, and we're happy to reach back out to folks to provide answers to those questions. So with that, Crystal, before we ask questions to you and the Lotus team, have I missed anything that you all wanted to cover, and do you want to add before we go into questions?
No, not from my perspective. I do think some of these questions actually highlight some good details to flag. So I think these questions actually, as we answer them, will provide some of the details that we may have missed. We actually have about 5 to 8 questions here. So I'll go through these questions. If people have questions, please keep entering them in the chat. Just know if you do raise your hand, we'll be going through these questions for the next 5 to 10 minutes. So we have some pretty simple questions, Keith, coming up. The first one that came through was, what happens if a building owner doesn't comply with the BPS? What enforcement mechanisms or penalties are there? And I can provide you some help here as well. But we can say that the statute, HB 21-1286, does provide some stipulations here in regards to the building performance standards. Essentially, the max fine for the first violation to the standard would be $2,000. The max fine for a second violation would be $5,000. That is all the information the statute provides. And so the task force is still working and deliberating on a proposal to the AQCC around this. And another, I know Keith mentioned this in the beginning, but public buildings are exempt from these fines as well. And we have a definition on a slide for the public buildings that is on our website. Keith, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
No, thank you, Crystal. I appreciate that. I think you captured it perfectly.
I may tackle some of these questions as well. So the next question is, will the state be using the same Energy Star gross floor area definition that Denver used? And what I can say is that, again, our statute defines this, and we can copy this and put this in the chat. But according to our statute, gross floor area means the total building area. And again, for the state's program, this is 50,000 square feet or above. So this is the total building area as measured from the outside surface of each exterior wall of the building, including above grade and below grade space. So this is quoted in our statute, and so that is what we are relying on. The next question, we're going through these here. What other metrics besides site UI did the task force consider? How are you going to distinguish between gas and electric use under a total site UI target? And I can let the Lotus team provide some background here as well if I miss anything. But essentially, the task force considered multiple different BPS metrics. One was site UI, the other was source EUI, and the other one was a greenhouse gas intensity target, which is what New York City uses. And the task force was very concerned with the applicability for building owners and making sure that this metric was very easy for building owners to understand, but also track. And that is how they came down to the vote on using site UI, since Energy Star Portfolio Manager provides this very easily and calculates it for the building owners based on their energy use. Also, these site UI targets, which will be calculated by the state, these targets will be including, it will be a site UI target that includes both gas and electric use. So it will be a joint target. However, if anyone has feedback on the methodology of these targets and how this should be calculated, we do have a survey open, and we do have the link that we can post in the chat again, but please feel free to provide any of your feedback through that survey. Julia, did you want to provide any other information there?
No, I think you really got it, Crystal. Thanks. I'll drop a link for that survey in the chat, though, since you've just mentioned it.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Julia.
The next question is, when may we expect the BPS to be applied to the existing 2.1 million homes in Colorado? I will say good job on knowing that count. But this statute, the benchmarking and the building performance standards, only applies to commercial, multifamily, and public buildings 50,000 square feet and above. Our statute exempts single family homes, townhomes, or duplexes and triplexes. So those residential buildings are not covered by this. Maybe in the future, but that's not something the state can provide any comment on as of yet. And then moving on to the next question as well, how is the 80% electrification demonstrated? So Keith showed this in that map of the main compliance pathways being energy efficiency and also 80% electrification. So the task force deliberated for a while on this. And so what this electrification compliance pathway shows is that documentation will have to be provided by a building owner, but essentially if a building owner electrifies 80% of their building, including space and water loads, they would be granted compliance with their EUI target. We wanted to incentivize building electrification, but we didn't want to make it mandatory. So this was a way that if a building did electrify 80% of the load and provided documentation to the state, then we could grant compliance with that target. Moving on to some other questions. Keith, were there any comments you wanted to add to any of these?
No, thank you. I think you hit it all. I appreciate it.
Okay. Moving on, these are a little bit out of order right now as the questions are coming in, but we also have another question on, will the BPS standards include emissions from refrigerant leakage, particularly in grocery stores and refrigerated warehouses? And this is a really good question, and it is something that the task force considered. As Keith mentioned earlier, again, these recommendations are more broad. We will pass it to the Air Quality Control Commission to write the more detailed rules. So this is something that the task force considered, but it's not something that we've explicitly have a proposal or vote around. So if there's any feedback on how the state can incorporate these refrigerant leakages into the BPS, please, again, provide that through our survey and provide us that feedback. Another good question, actually, Keith, I think you're going to be able to add something to this question, but can we expect the BPS to begin thinking about smart buildings that are able to work with smart meters to do demand load balancing and therefore mitigate the second generation tariffs through smart load balancing?
Yeah, and that is, thank you, Crystal. That is an excellent question. And the task force has been looking at both demand response and technologies that would enable more demand flexibility. At the moment, we don't have, the task force doesn't have a specific recommendation. I think that they are still thinking through how to address, in particular, demand flexibility, which is, not directly going to reduce site EUI, but is a set of technologies that can enable greater levels of energy efficiency, greater levels of on-site renewable, and then can align with potentially tariffs and other utility applications that would allow for decreases in building emissions overall. So we are working through some of the issues around that with the task force, and I think we are likely to see a recommendation from the Energy Office to the task force to consider demand response and demand flexibility. Of course, that's subject to a vote of the task force if that's a recommendation that they ultimately want to bring back to our director and to the Air Commission.
We actually have another question that I think you'll be able to add some insight into, Keith, on. So in regards to the RECs, renewable energy credits usually are awarded on a one-to-one basis for energy, for energy use, not based on emissions. Will the state apply a correction factor that requires purchasing more RECs to come out even on an emission basis?
Who asked that question? I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. So if they want to unmute themselves, perhaps.
Looks like Matthew Dahlhausen. Matthew, are you available?
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat is this the question on the RECs?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. RECs are one-to-one on an energy basis. They're not on an emissions basis. And the time of use of when the energy is produced, say solar power, the emissions on the grid at that time are lower than, say, the evening hours. So if you're using, say, a solar REC, for instance, to offset just a general nighttime energy use, then you're not going to be one-to-one on emissions basis. You will on an energy basis, but not emissions. So you need about 20% more or 30% more REC purchases to compensate.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question, and I think I understand it now. The way, again, this is obviously something that will be worked out in the process of the rulemaking at the Air Commission. But I think what you might anticipate is that the rules will contemplate a utility emissions factor and just credit the solar production against the utility emissions factor. We right now don't have the capability on most of the state's utilities to actually look at fine-grained enough energy production data and consumption data to get to anything like a 15-minute increment of production against emissions. That makes sense. That helpful, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can calculate it roughly, right? I mean, you could just say like a simple number like 20% or something, and it doesn't have to be like 18.34%. But I think you can calculate it pretty easily from the data that we have available. What that correction factor like roughly should be.
We're happy to take that feedback. Again, this isn't something that the task force itself is working through as an issue. This is something that I think we'll get to in the process of development of rules.
Moving on to some other questions, and thank you for that detailed question, Matthew. We actually have a few questions again on civil penalties for the BPS, and so I'm going to kind of lump these together. But someone asked us if these fines are annual or monthly or daily, and how to incentivize building owners to comply and to make the cost of compliance cheaper than the cost of a penalty. And so again, the statute is very broad when it comes to this, and the task force is still deliberating this and still coming to creating a proposal around this that would provide direction to the AQCC on whether this should be monthly or annual or whatever basis it should be. So the task force's final recommendations will be published on the Energy Office's website by October 1st. And so whatever proposal the task force does come forward with will be included in those recommendations. But as of right now, we cannot answer those questions because the task force hasn't had a final vote on those details. But again, if you have any suggestions on how these penalties should be levied, please provide that in our survey. And we also have a question around peak. And so someone asked, is the fundamental driver of the building performance standard the idea of shaving the peak or flattening the duct curve? And so I'll actually throw this one to Keith, but I want to say that the fundamental driver of the BPS for the state is lowering the building sector's greenhouse gas reductions. And I would say the second fundamental driver, or what building owners can use to drive that, is the first compliance pathway, which is energy efficiency. So Keith has talked about demand response and demand flexibility programs, but the first concern of the BPS is not immediately trying to shave the peak of the grid. And Keith, I'm not sure if you talked about the statute and not counting the greenhouse gas emission reductions of the utility sector or the grid sector. So if you'd like to add some information to this question, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. So again, Crystal's right that this really starts with what can we do to meet the sector-based targets of 7% and 20%. And so it's really looking at driving changes in energy use intensity in order to meet an emissions reduction target overall. Right now, the intent is not to sort of change the nature of the duct curve from buildings as a matter of the BPS policy. That may be a set of policies that emerge in different utility filings and in different utility plans, and there's certainly great benefits to being able to, I think the term is fill the belly of the duck, but the BPS itself is not intended to drive that particular change right now. That may be a partial effect as we think about, for example, reductions in energy consumption during those hours, coupled with changes in generation and then load shifting as we think about demand response and demand flexibility. So the real core of the recommendation from the task force is a reduction in site EUI in order to drive towards the 7% and the 20% set of emissions reductions.
Thank you for that, Keith. Another question that's actually tangential to the BPS, but something the state is actually very happy with, is on building codes and energy codes. And so this person asked, is the state looking at getting involved in creating codes for future buildings in Colorado? I manage a building that opened in late 2018, and depending on my EUI, it seems disconnected to require new compliance standards 4 years later after the building was built. And so with the BPS, again, when we thought about high performing buildings, we were hoping that as new buildings come online, they will have to comply with the BPS, but that hopefully they will reach those property targets because they're already high performing, they were newly built. However, this is something that Keith actually worked really hard on as well. And I think some people on the call may have actually been part of our stakeholder engagement groups on this. But the state did actually pass new energy code legislation requiring new construction to be built by a minimum energy code. And Keith, I wasn't sure if you wanted to actually discuss some of those details or provide an overview of that legislation and how it possibly connects to these newer buildings.
Yeah, so I think that the big thing is to say that, we are just about to start the process under the statute to stand up a group that will help develop the language around the building codes going forward. And so, as Crystal pointed out, the intent is not to penalize building owners for buildings that were built, but really, I think the program was set up in a way that would hopefully allow high performing buildings to come into compliance either as they are or very quickly, but to ensure that for buildings that are not high performing buildings, we really are putting in place a process that gives them the flexibility to then meet the site EUI targets. The code changes will all be prospective, not retrospective. And so, that's not something that building owners of existing buildings would need to come into compliance with unless they're, making changes that would subject them to the code requirements at that point in time. So
Thank
there's a
you
lot
for
more to
that.
come on the code side of things.
Yes, stay tuned. We have a lot of good legislation that passed at the state in the past few years. So we're working hard here at the Energy Office. One final question before we allow people to raise their hands and maybe verbally ask some questions. There is actually a really good question on around incentives and how the state or the BPS task force has thought about the cost of compliance with the building performance standards, and if building owners pass these costs to their tenants if they're a multifamily building, and what considerations we have around these. So the task force has considered this and has talked about this, and they are still finalizing some proposals around these details, but it is something that was a huge concern for the task force. So we don't have any of those details that we can provide right now. Unfortunately, that's something they're still discussing in July, but it is something that the state and the task force take seriously. And so we have discussed programs and incentives either from the state or other groups that we can provide to help building owners comply and not pass that cost on to tenants, because that's not what this building performance standard is trying to do. So if you have any feedback on programs or incentives that could help avoid this, please, again, put it in our survey. Again, the survey is open until July 22nd, next Friday. So any feedback, we welcome there. And so Lotus or Julia, let me know if there's any questions we missed. But if anyone would like to raise their hand and ask us a question, this would be a great time.
And Crystal, while they're doing that, I just dropped into the chat the codes bill number and a short description of the bill for folks in case they want to go looking for it.
Perfect, thank you. And I do see there are some comments in the chat coming in about gross floor area. That is something that the state will talk about internally. Right now it is defined in statute. So that is the definition the state has been working on, but we can provide more guidance and details on this at the future public engagement meetings. But does anyone on the call have any questions that they would like to ask, either through the chat or raise their hand? Or if there's any other details you would like us to go through again in that PowerPoint, we can reshare the slides and kind of go through any of those details that we may have brushed over very quickly.
Well, I will say we do encourage questions and feedback. Appreciate the opportunity to engage in the dialogue today. We'll have 2 additional meetings. They will largely cover the same ground that we have covered today. So, they're not intended to be additive, but really to give different opportunities for folks who might want to hear from us and participate in the conversation. And the next one of those is on the 14th, so 2 days from now, same time, 3 to 5. And then we'll have an additional meeting on the 20th of July from 3 to 5.
Yes, Keith, can you actually share your screen again and go to the last slide, or the second to last slide? I want to make sure everyone has a QR code that they can see these dates, and also scan the QR code to go to the survey. Although I think we put the link in the chat, we can do that again.
There we go.
As Keith, yep, there we go. So as Keith mentioned, we have those 2 meetings, and then you can scan that code and it will take you directly to the survey as well. And I do see that a question came through the chat on the EUI property targets, and if that is going to be part of the final recommendations that will be available on our website on October 1st. And so I think we've talked about this during the presentation, but I think we mentioned it in many different ways. But essentially the main metric is site EUI, and there will be property targets set for the different property types. That is not up to the task force. The task force provided the guidance on using site EUI property targets, but the state, Keith and I will be working with Group 14, and also working with our vendor for the benchmarking data, Touchstone, and using the 2021 benchmarking data to set those targets. And all of these targets will be using Colorado specific data to make sure that these targets are as true to Colorado buildings as they can be. And so those targets will eventually be published online for the public to review, but that will be in February February or March of 2023. They will not be available by October because the state will still be in the process of calculating them. So again, if you have feedback on the methodology or how these targets or what these targets should include, please again put that in the survey, but these targets will not be available to the public until February or March of next year.
And it's worth reminding folks that, you know, that's still well before any building owner would need to comply. So there is a timeline built in for that. Thank you.
Yes, and I believe Keith mentioned that too, but once those targets are available, those final rules will be available to the public as well, probably around March of next year. And those rules will not go into effect until June of 2023. So it's an iterative process. We have a timeline. We want to make sure the public has enough time to review them too. Lotus or Julia, Keith, are there any other final comments we want to share with the public?
Again, I want to thank you, Crystal, for all the work that you've done on the task force and helping to support the work of the task force, and say thank you to everyone on the call. If you have questions, you should have my email, you should have Crystal's email. Please reach out to us. We are happy to talk through any of the slides from today or other issues or questions that you may have.
I don't have anything to add, but thank you all so much for being here today and providing your input and insight. That's incredibly valuable in making sure that we get this right for Colorado. So the task force is meeting again at the end of the month, so we'll be sharing with them all of the different information and questions that we've received from you all. So keep those, as Keith said, please just keep those questions and comments coming over the coming weeks, and we'll make sure they are integrated into our final task force conversation and the recommendations that ultimately come out of this process.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.